First, I want to start off, like, how did this collaboration come about with Steve and you? Like, how did you guys come together when you were making this Evil Dead game? Did you reach out to Joe? Did Steve reach out to you? Like, how did that relationship happen?
Joe,
Steve,
you want to take that one?
all right, well, I'll take it because I think the journey went something like this. Um, I was asked early in the development of the game to be involved with the music, which was really nice. A man named Steve Harris, who I believe is involved in setting up the entire deal with Renaissance Pictures and with Saber and
That's
however
true.
those relationships work. And years went by for one reason or another. And when it came time to work on the music, there was the collaboration with Saber. And of course, Steve is already an established composer and a game composer and wonderful musician. And so it was decided that we would kind of work together on all of this. And it was great. It was a great collaboration. And we divided up the responsibilities accordingly. And Steve can take it from there.
Yeah. So we wanted to figure out a way. See, we're collaborating right now. This works so well.
Right.
Set
Yeah.
it up. I finish it up. Yeah, we were thinking about the best way to do it, and to me, it was always a given that Joe would do the main title. He's just so familiar with the Evil Dead universe, and he, as you know, obviously really created the sound of Evil Dead throughout the decades. So Joe ended up doing the main theme and the lobbies for the two gameplay modes, Demon and Survivor. And then from those, we sort of extrapolated and mined some post-game cues, depending on whether you win or lose and all those types of things. And then I ended up doing all the in-game music. So just exploring the maps and combat and boss battles and all that kind of stuff. So Joe basically did the menus and I did the in-game stuff. And it worked out really nicely because we were working on the same project and we were communicating a lot and sort of sharing our approaches in terms of instrumentation and sounds and these types of things. But we also had the freedom to work independently. So it was kind of a cool process since we were working on two different parts of the game. We really had the freedom to sort of explore our own artistic expression simultaneously, which was, I don't know, I enjoyed the process. And then every now and then we would check in and share things with each other. Like I remember, Joe, I shared that end credits sound design I did for that song, Who's Laughing Now? And then you gave me some great ideas. I don't know if you had a chance to hear any of that stuff. Did you hear any of the music we sent over?
I did. I liked. I mean, if it's very horish, very Evil Dead. Like it sounds really good.
Did you by chance hear that end credits theme?
I did. The acoustic guitar, that rhythm.
Yeah. So about halfway through that one, these demons take over the track, and I just did all this sound design where this old tape machine sort of melts and the demon comes in and sniffs around and growls and barks. And in my mind, it was just like some old lost Nobi tape that a Deadite somehow infiltrated, and I sent it to Joe, and he said, "Oh yeah, what if the demon controls the whole track?" And or what? It was just kind of a cool little moment for us to bounce ideas off each other in that way. But I feel like within our own personal composing, we had a lot of freedom to just sort of explore, and that was by design, so that we would sort of each have a very raw, unfiltered, honest approach to our own music for the game.
Now, Joe, you've done so much film and television, but I've never seen you do a video game before. Was this a new process for you? I mean, you've licensed some of your music out to other games, but I have never seen you actually compose on a video game before. Was this a new process for you specifically?
No, this was the first. This was really the first time. And it was great to have Steve shepherd me through it. And I think the way that we divided the responsibilities made a lot of sense. I could do some overarching themes and kind of be the guideposts, if you will. And then to have Steve handle the player experience, because he's, so experienced with that. And what he's done is great. I mean, it's on 11 the whole time. and it's there.
I
In
couldn't
fact,
help it.
I wanted to ask you, is that also within the game experience? Are those tracks also the type that layer over time, or are they standalones, if you will?
No, they do layer. That's a great question. Actually, we did a cool thing with the in-game music when you're sort of wandering through the forest and exploring the map and trying to find the lost pages of the Necronomicon or whatever your mission might be. When you're just exploring and there's no, let's say you're playing as a survivor and there's no real enemy contact, you're going to hear these sort of ambient, ominous drones and tracks of these sort of light orchestral arrangements that are just sort of giving you this sense of impending doom that is around the next corner, but you don't know when it's going to hit. And there are no drums in that layer. But then as you start to approach enemies, the drum track blends in and increases in volume with your proximity to the enemies. Or it also serves as a clue if you're getting closer to things, the music will change and intensify. So there are certain layers that are sort of reactive based on the player's choices and gameplay. So yeah, that was kind of cool. But a lot of that stuff that you hear is kind of a set piece, like the boss battles. Those are sort of triggered at that exact moment when you encounter the boss. And some of them like that, I think I sent you a couple of those horde pieces, sort of a horde mode if there are a lot of enemies on screen. That was a really cool design choice that the studio in Madrid made, where they said, I think, because we originally had 3 classes of music: explore, combat, and boss. And at some point they said, how about we do something when there are just a ton of enemies on screen to really heighten the emotion? So that horde cue, the first one especially, really is at 11 the whole time.
My next question would be really interesting. This Evil Dead franchise has spawned 4 feature films, a TV show, and this can get really complicated in terms of license rights. Joe, who owns your music and your themes to Evil Dead 1, Evil Dead 2, Army of Darkness, Ash vs. Evil Dead? Is it the studio? Do you own the rights? Did you license any of the themes out for the game? I thought I heard the Forest of the Dead in there somewhere, very subtly.
There's 3 different ownerships on the 3 different parts of the trilogy, and as it turned out, I was able to own the soundtrack for the compositions, if you will, for the first Evil Dead. And then I don't know where the rights exist anymore, and that's something that they've had to track down. Perhaps MGM might have Army of Darkness, and Canal Plus maybe has Evil Dead 2. That's my recent recollection, but I'm not sure. And again, I think that would be the kind of thing where our friend Steve Harris maybe had to negotiate, get all those rights together. We didn't really use any of the music per se. The Sound of the Force, it was always a collaboration. Actually, in the very first shot of the first Evil Dead movie, that's Sam Raimi's voice through a pitch shifter, through a harmonizer. And
nice.
With drones from me and weird Roland SH-101 cat sounds. It's whatever we could throw together with Spit and Glue. And so that's also how we begin the main title. It's just so, it's what you associate, and it's a great way to begin and end the main title.
So then my next question is for Steve. How much, your team watched all the Evil Dead films and Ash vs. Evil Dead. What did you pull from those that inspired you to create, the Demon soundtrack or the Survivor soundtrack in the game itself?
Great question. Well, I was definitely inspired by Joe's work. As I said earlier, he really created the sound of this Evil Dead universe. And I've been a fan throughout the decades. So I was inspired by his music, and before I started composing anything, we were using a lot of his Army of Darkness stuff in there as placeholder, building the Death Coaster, Fresh Panic. Do these titles ring a bell?
Yes. I love the Death Coaster theme. It's one of my favorite themes, yeah.
So I was hearing these things, and what really inspired me was just the way the music took all these twists and turns and had a very lyrical narrative sense to it, where they were these little vignettes telling their own little stories within the greater storyline of the films and TV shows. So I sort of wanted to continue that way of thinking. I don't know if that's fair to say, Joe, but that's how I felt when I was...
Well, yeah, and I think, it's by design. When we started, my references were classical music, not film music, and Sam Raimi's influences were the Harryhausen films. It was Bernard Herrmann, and so it was in 1980. Even then, it was kind of retro to have this string quintet
Right.
that was playing notes. There was some sound design in there, and there were a lot of effects that we obviously took advantage of. But it was narrative in, even then, kind of a retro way, and we kept with that throughout. I mean, Army of Darkness it's an adventure fantasy with some horror thrown in. So I think Steve and I both agreed that to begin the world that we were in, we were going to pay homage to the fact that it was real instruments playing some real music. And then we're going to add to that. I think what I tried to do in my work was to try to contemporize that, in that, it is hybrid. There are synths, there are other sound design elements contained within the music, but it is primarily musical to begin with. So we both knew that that would be our choice of instrumentation. So we both went with that, and that's why, I guess, one of the reasons the whole thing sounds quite unified, even though we went about our own business separately.
Yeah, we definitely wanted it to have that orchestral traditional feel. But as you said, we also did, I remember on one of our early calls, we talked about having it be more of a hybrid orchestra, that kind of a sound. And then to further answer your question, as far as drawing inspiration from going back to all the films and TV shows, I sort of drew inspiration there, but ultimately, obviously, then the real goal is to just create the best possible player experience and to make sure that the music supports the gameplay, especially since we had the unique opportunity with this game, with the two different gameplay modes, to sort of cater to the different emotions of each mode. So I ended up writing two separate soundtracks. So you'll hear one complete soundtrack if you're playing in Demon mode, and a completely separate one if you're playing in Survivor. And of course, the Demon music is more sinister, ominous, and heavier, and then the Survivor is more triumphant and adventurous and heroic. And I also felt like there was an opportunity to apply certain instruments and performances to sort of have them correspond to the game environments and art style as well. So sometimes these aleatoric pianos are trickling down, and maybe that matches a gentle rain, as you're exploring the evening forest, or maybe there's a heavy growling trombone that matches kind of the moment when Ash's chainsaw kind of roars and fires it up, and then you have this big brass section or something. So to me, it's always about just supporting the player experience. My goal is always for people to feel the music, but not necessarily hear it, because I don't want to distract them from gameplay. I just want I want to try to heighten their emotions. I think Joe also did a great job of setting the stage. I think you used the term guideposts. That's a great way of saying it, because when you turn the game on, you hear this epic main theme that you establish that has all these little vignettes and storytelling within it. That sort of preps you for the lobby. Then you get to the lobby, and now there's this sense of anticipation, and you're just so ready to play. So I really feel like there's a nice emotional crescendo that happens as you're preparing to play the game and then play the game. And hopefully the music supports that and people can feel it.
Technology has evolved a lot since 1981. Have these technologies improvements, like in music and software and creating sounds electronically, does that make your job easier? I know, Joe, you mentioned you're classically trained. Steve, you probably used a lot of this stuff before it was even available to people, like in the 80s. You talk about some of that process and how that helps you guys creatively expand the sound and your creativity.
To me, the technology at any given time is just another tool for expression. I still have a bunch of analog gear and all my old synths that are, I was telling Joe earlier today about this Krumar Performer that I'm playing on one of the songs. It's definitely not modern technology, but it has this analog warmth and it's just a certain sound. So the technology has definitely improved the workflow, which is a huge part of it, especially in Joe's world, which I haven't had to deal with as much because, like you mentioned, I work on some of these games for 2 years or longer. But when you're working in film or TV and you have 3 weeks to turn this entire thing around, you already have your musical ability and your creative intuitions, but the technology can help you reach those visions more easily. So I feel very fortunate to be making music during this time when the technology is so powerful and intuitive. Sometimes I work on a piece of music and I think, wow, if this was 20 or 30 years ago, it would have taken me 3 weeks to do what I did in 3 days. And I'm grateful in those moments. On the other hand, sometimes because I have the 3 weeks in games, I will still take the 3 weeks, or sometimes I'll take the 3 months to explore that thing and really go back to more of an analog approach and try to really just explore the tones and textures in a more primitive way and try to capture that raw emotion and then update it within the modern technology. So I try to find a balance between old and new within my approach.
I think it's a double-edged sword. I mean,
Yeah.
I couldn't have done Evil Dead without the other musicians. It wouldn't have been possible at that point in time. And I feel one of the downsides of the technology is it's isolated us, because we can do this all by ourselves. It's so easy to do. And unfortunately, it's expected. Turnaround times get tighter. More changes can be made because they know you can, because you have the technology. And the time even to hire other players is kind of has to be folded into this. Now, I'm not talking about doing a Marvel movie here. That's a whole different organizational structure. But I think it's enabled us to make music faster, not necessarily better. So you have to always be aware of that. And sometimes you just have to go with the flow and get it done. I think that there's all these wonderful libraries. I mean, anything you can imagine is available. I think it's important to try to make your own sounds when you can, but you can always look it up and probably find something that's been recorded better and more extensively. What tends to happen, though, is everybody's got the same toolkit, so that there are a lot of libraries, for example, that are designed for game composers because of what's required in that world. And so as a result, a lot of homogeneity creeps into that world, as there is for film composing, or what's the flavor of the month. So if we noticed in the game world, certainly, and certainly in the film world, what gets recognized, what always opens my eyes, is when a composer is doing something that's outside the box for some reason. In one way, the toolkit or the approach is different and outstanding. So it will always be that way.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something that made me think that sometimes I like to use the technology as my starting point, just to sort of sketch some ideas, and then if I have the time, I'll go back and re-record it with my own instrument or something. So sometimes I'll start with a sample library, and if rather than overthink the sound during the writing process, then you kind of think, all right, well, how can I go back and sort of tweak that a little bit so that it's unrecognizable, or
and that's the beauty of the technology now.
Yeah, that's where it comes in.
When I did Evil Dead, I had to actually calculate the hit points.
You did it on tape too, right? You had to do it like on tape too. It wasn't like a digital analog.
Yeah, well, it was mathematical against a videotape with time code. It was dreadful. It was a dreadful experience.
We've come a long way.
Yeah, and then there was a Roland box that could actually read time code, and you could pre-program tempos, and it was laborious, but at least you had that reaction. Now you can look at picture and you can say, oh, I'll look at it in the morning and pick up exactly where you left off. So that's the beauty of it. The beauty of it for a composer is you get immediate feedback, and you can run with that.
Yeah, you don't have to wait for dailies the day afterwards to be developed either. Like you could just right there. It's insane how far we've come in terms of filmmaking and just media in general. Is there any real replacement, no matter how good technology gets, with keyboard or synth or synthetic sounds and instruments? Is there anything that can really replace like a full orchestra with like a choir? Like, are we there yet? Like, when will we get there, do you think?
We're getting closer. That's all I can say. Yeah, it's just a lot of work. It's, they're freeze-dried performances, and it's a lot of work to bring them to life, and you can get it to a certain point. And it depends on the music. Unfortunately, very often, the performances that have been recorded is what you're stuck with, and they become your vocabulary instead of the infinite degrees of interpretation that a live master musician can give you. So, you know, sometimes your vocabulary becomes what those samples sound good at doing as opposed to what you might imagine. So it's a real trap.
That's that's a really fair assessment. Yeah, you sort of develop a relationship with the sounds and capabilities of those sample libraries. Yeah, you don't want to find yourself compromising just because that's all you have available. You want to try to follow the sound that's in your head. Something that a lot of composers do, and that I certainly do myself based on how much sort of time I have available and all that other stuff, is sometimes, you know, you work within the technology, and the truth is that the sample libraries have really turned a corner. A number of years ago, you could always tell if the strings were real or not. And these days, more like you said, we're getting closer and closer. It's like the audio equivalent of the uncanny valley, I guess. But we're getting very close to the point where you might not be able to tell the difference on a lot of these things, and because the samples are so well recorded, and they give you 4 or 5 different mic choices and reverb, mic placements and all these different things that you can blend in to your own taste. And the articulations have gotten so detailed. So you really, once you have an understanding of an instrument, you know the type of attack you want, and when you want the vibrato to come in, you can kind of manipulate and perform all of those in a much more convincing way than you could 5 or 10 years ago. But
it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. That's what I was going to say, is there's all that extra automation and programming, and it really is a lot of work. But if that's all you have, then it's good to know that it can be done. Something I like to do, I don't know if you do this much, Joe, is I'll sort of, for meat and potatoes, I'll maybe use some sample libraries, but then I'll have a soloist play over the top to sweeten the track a little. So maybe you have the solo vocalist who's really providing the flourishes and drawing the ear, but sort of that foundation that people feel rather than hear, as I was saying earlier, maybe that can come from a sample library. So it's sort of, and then you can kind of trick the ear a little bit if you have this combination between sampled and performed. As long as you have enough of the live, it somehow sort of fools the ear, like a Gestalt thing where our mind fills in the missing spaces, and you think, wow, that must all be real. Am I revealing too much?
No, there's a lot of sleight of hand that goes on.
Yeah, it is kind of sleight of hand, but it's
when you don't have access to the full band.
Yeah, it's the time and budget, and like you said, a Marvel movie is obviously a different deal. But if you have 2 days to turn something around for an indie film or something, it's like, okay, what can we do here, and how can we sort of make it sound convincing in that setting?
Well, and Evil Dead, the original Evil Dead, is sort of a case study for how do you do more with less, and sometimes that's a lot more fun than having all of the 60 strings to make scratchy sounds.
Yeah.
When you're on a video game, or even Joe, when you're working with Steve on the video game, is it more like a creative process where you don't have to like check with the director and check with like the producers and check with like the actors to see if they like something? It's mainly just you and the creative director saying, yeah, that's good, or no, that's not good? Because video games are so much different than film in terms of there's an interactive element. Like the creative director may know a lot about game design, but nothing about music. Can you talk about that process a little bit? Steve, we'll start with you.
I would say it really varies from game to game or project to project. I've really had it go both ways. I've done some games where I did an hour, or in some cases 7 hours of music for a game, and I didn't receive a single note of feedback. It was just every submission was approved and accepted, and they said, this is great. This is just what we had in mind. I've had other things where I'm getting feedback from 10 or 15 different people, various producers, creative directors, studio heads, and all of these people. And that gets fun because, there are 12 people critiquing something and 6 love it and say 6, and 6 say it's perfect. And
it's too loud, it's too soft. Which one is it? Is it too loud or too soft?
Yeah, I forget who said it. Might have been Napoleon. There's no vision in democracy, was the quote. And sometimes I think about that within game production. At a certain point, you kind of need someone to steer the ship, or you need to at least kind of tighten up the creative feedback loop. So I personally love the collaborative process. I love when my feedback comes from the studio head who is wearing a million different hats, and the last thing they need to be thinking about is the music. But occasionally they check in and they say, hey, I love this. And it's cool because sometimes we as creatives can't see the forest through the trees, an appropriate Evil Dead expression right now. But if you're too close to something, sometimes you lose your perspective. And even if you're just working with a small team of collaborators, it sometimes helps for me to have somebody with fresh ears listen to something and say, and speak in non-musical terms, and just say, oh, I like the energy, but it feels like it could be faster. And they may not even know what they mean by faster, or it feels like it could be louder or higher or bigger or smaller. And just those oversimplifications are kind of nice to hear during the production process. So it really varies, though, to answer your question. Some projects I have total autonomy and I just operate in a vacuum and I'm alone in the studio. Like Joe said, it isolates us sometimes, the technology, and I'm like, all work and no play makes, Jack a dull boy or whatever. And it's like, is this even good? I can't tell anymore, but here's the music. And then they say, oh, we love it. It's great. Other times I do something that I think is the best thing I've ever done. And I play it for them like, not quite what we had in mind. It's like, okay. So I don't know. It really varies from project to project. I don't know. How about you, Joe?
I've been, luckily, in my experience, 9 times out of 10 been protected in that there's only one person that I have to answer to, whether that be the director that has enough respect from his producers or a showrunner of a television series. And it's just kind of merging with their version. And in many cases, I've been hired in the first place because they've heard my music. And so they kind of have an idea of what they're getting or what kind of approach I take. So it's my job to realize their vision. So I have to do the translating. And as long as that communication is trusting and open, we'll get there. We're going to get there. It's a fact. It's when there's, as Steve has mentioned, when there are a number of voices perhaps playing some sort of dominant game that doesn't have anything to do with you, is where it can get complicated. But again, you're the music guy. You're the head of the music department. So it isn't as though it's your show. You didn't get into this to become a recording artist with your name on the album. So
yeah, I think that as composers, even going back to your band days, because we both played in bands, in a band we're always trying to serve the song. Especially if there's a vocalist, you want to support the vocalist. So you're comping jazz guitar. If there's a vocalist singing, you're going to lay back, play chords, try different voicings, try not to draw too much attention, and really support, provide harmonies that support the vocal. When it's your time to improvise and solo, okay, now that's a different way of supporting the music. And I feel like as composers, we do the same thing where we're trying to serve the greater good of the project itself. In this case, with games, we're trying to create the best possible player experience. So we're sort of serving gameplay, serving the creative direction of the game overall. So early on, when Joe and I were looking at gameplay footage and character design and all this other stuff, thinking, okay, now we see how the game feels. How does it sound? And how can we sort of compose in a way that's going to just amplify the creative vision of the talented team of hundreds or sometimes thousands of people who are also working on this game. Like you said, we're the music guy, but there are so many other departments who are working so hard in parallel. So it's a great experience trying to put it all together and solve this little creative riddle. And Joe, it was a pleasure to work with you and to have that back and forth. And
same here, because that was it. It was just us.
Yeah,
there was no other voices chiming in, no other interference.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, what do you want to do with this thing?
Yeah.
And we're just trying to serve the material.
Absolutely.
Well, guys, I mean, the game comes out May 13th, which is incidentally my birthday, which is hilarious.
Hey,
the same day as my birthday, and it'll be on PlayStation, Xbox, Epic Game Store, all cross Nintendo Switch, all cross-play at launch, which is great, at a premium price point of $39.99, so it's $20 cheaper than your average video game retail. You guys, Saber has gone beyond getting Bruce and you, Joe, and everyone working on this game that had touched the Evil Dead franchise in some capacity to make sure that they're being true to the story and the fan base. And it's been just a delight to see how much effort went into this game to make sure that it really was the ultimate love letter to Evil Dead franchise and their fan base. Thank you guys so much for your time. I know you are both extremely busy in this world of entertainment media, so I want to thank you for your time, and hopefully I'll talk to you soon.